This episode of the Craftsman Online podcast is sponsored by Bricks Masons. From elegant Masonic rings that showcase your commitment to our craft to finely crafted regalia and apparel that honor your tradition, Bricks Masons delivers quality and craftsmanship that truly stands out. Shop now at bricksmasons.com and use promo code CRAFTSMAN, that's CRAFTSMEN, to receive free shipping with your first order.
The comments, opinions, and views shared during this program are of those individual Freemasons and do not reflect the official position of a Grand Lodge, concordant body, appendant body, Masonic Authority, or craftsmanonline.com. Welcome to the Craftsman Online podcast, the only 5-star rated Masonic podcast endorsed by the Grand Lodge of New York. And now your host, Worshipful Brother, Michael Arce.
Hey, welcome back. A bit of a role reversal on this episode of the Craftsman Online podcast as I got to be the interviewee, thanks to Right Worshipful Jim MacDuff, who is the host of Everyday Leaders, his radio program on Rochester Free Radio. In this episode, Jim and I focused on leadership principles from John Maxwell to the 15 Laws of Growth to some of my ideas on how George Washington really embodies leadership for Freemasons. We also talk about my personal belief on how I believe not only does Freemasonry make good men better, but it also makes good men better leaders. So without further ado, let's join this radio interview already in progress.
Michael Arce is host of Craftsman Online, which is a Masonic-themed podcast. I've been enjoying that and listening to myself. Been listening to you. I very much enjoy. Good evening, Michael.
Good evening. I'm so used to like Masonic titles.
Yeah.
And it's been a while since I've been a guest, and it's also been a while since I've been back on FM radio. So I'll just say thank you for having me, brother Jim.
Oh, you're quite welcome. And Everyday Leaders talks to everyday people who lead from where they are. So as you and I know, as anybody in the craft knows, leadership and masonry go hand in glove. It's a very natural relationship. So, and that's why I've had a lot of guys on the show, quite frankly, because that's what we do, right? That's what we talk about. That's what we espouse in our lodges. It's what our ritual tells us. Glad that you made time for me tonight. Thank you. I appreciate you coming on the show.
And it's interesting too, because on my end, doing a podcast that does kind of focus on Freemasonry and is open to anyone that would have a general interest in it, leadership is one of the topics. I think if you go back through the 4 seasons that we've done this, we've only touched on it a handful of times. So when you spoke to like, hey, would you like to come on and talk about leadership? It really got me thinking, like, we don't talk enough about that, I feel, in some lodges or in some brothers. So I'm happy to jump into this conversation. I was very excited about it.
I've been looking forward to this conversation with you. If you could spin 1,000-foot view of Michael Arce in terms of where'd you grow up, where'd you go to school? Just give us a Reader's Digest version or bio of Michael Arce.
Everything I've done in my life, I did out of order, except for Freemasonry. I think that was the one thing that I actually went, because we do have a pretty rigid process of becoming a member and petitioning a lodge and then going through the degrees. But
sure.
Yeah, I grew up in a really small farming community in southwestern Arizona. I was born in San Diego, California. We moved to Yuma, Arizona when I was 9 years old. You can see me, and I remember it's radio. The listeners can't see me.
You got a face for radio, brother. I'll tell you that right now.
I always sounded like this, but didn't look like it. My body eventually caught up with my voice. So, at the age of 15, that's when I started working in radio. I did that for almost 20 years professionally. I dropped out of college to sign my first radio contract at 18. Moved all the way around to upstate New York, to Maryland, back to upstate New York. And then, right around my mid-30s is when radio started contracting. You want to talk about like leadership. So it was like 2008, Obama's election. I was working for Clear Channel Radio at the time, and that's when they kind of had their reduction in force. So I saw a lot of close friends of mine, boxed up and walked out the door, and the light at the end of the tunnel was beginning to dim for me. So at that point, I realized, like, look, I basically just have a high school education. I need to find a way to provide for my family and do something else. So I went back to school. I got my undergrad degree. A few years later, got my master's degree. Went to law school for a year, decided that wasn't really going to be a good fit at that age and time in my life. Relocated from upstate New York to DC, and now I work in the government contracting space. So yeah, I've been all over the place.
Wow, that's a varied experience. It almost I don't know, Forrest Gump like, maybe. I don't know. In a good way. I'm not saying the character. I'm saying the experience.
Well, like I said, I mean, everything was out of order. I just had a conversation last month with my student loan provider and was like, do you know anybody else who will be paying back student loans? You see how old I am. I'm going to be paying these back until I'm in my 70s. Like, are you serious? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, gosh, I hope I live that long.
Well, yeah, I can commiserate with that. My wife's got a student loan too. What's your degree in? What did you go get a degree for?
Sure. So my undergrad is in business management and economics, and then my master's is an MBA in healthcare leadership, and then I have a 1 year of graduate studies in health law and policy.
Wow, very nice. So it's interesting, healthcare leadership. That's kind of curious to learn a little bit more about that, I guess, maybe.
Yeah, basically, in the healthcare industry, and I'm just using very broad strokes here when it comes to leadership. It used to be healthcare administration, but I went to a state school, go SUNY, and had to, take one of the SUNY school names. So it's healthcare leadership was the area specialty. But for the most part, when you look at the administration of a hospital or a healthcare organization, physicians tend to like to be in control of everything. So it's very rare these days that you see an outsider that doesn't have an MD or a bunch of other letters after their last name rise to the ranks of a CEO or the lead of a hospital group.
Okay.
So that's one thing that's interesting. But healthcare is like many other industries. I worked in the legal space for a little while. It can become very siloed, very top down. It's interesting now. I know we're going to be talking about leadership, which gets me excited is that I'm a big believer in servant leadership. And I think that that's something that is just kind of inherent in Freemasonry. So when we talk about the lodge leadership structure, well, it definitely has a who's in control, almost like a military rank and file system. The idea that leaders get in and work for the people who they basically act as a servant, just a time that you're in a chair or in a position of authority in the lodge is very similar to that servant leadership style.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more. And, having some similar travels. You're a past master of a lodge, are you not?
Technically, once you get elected, you become a past master, but I'm still serving. I have until December. The time is slowly falling out of my hourglass.
You're still serving then, okay. So well, you can still agree, though. I mean, I've always thought that being a leader in the craft or anywhere for that matter, servant leadership, you're pulling guys along behind you. You're helping them see the light, so to speak. That's a real ironic phrase in our line of work in that regard. But I've always thought that's the role of a leader in lodge is to help those guys explore those paths and understand things a little bit better, pulling them along at times, guiding them at times, standing aside at times to let them see better, that kind of thing. Boy, I heard a lot of things in your some things in your bio. Law of pain was one of them. That must have been kind of painful to go through that backward process. And I'm marveling, by the way, we'll have to talk more about this offline, but the parallels between you and I are somewhat interesting. pretty similar in a lot of ways. But talk to me about servant leadership besides Freemasonry, which can and does do things for the community in which they reside. What other things? Take me back. Let's go back to your early days. I mean, what kinds of servant leadership do you exercise outside the lodge or outside the home? Or are you active with a charity or a community group or anything like that? Or talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So before Freemasonry, because I grew up in a small farming community, I was a 4-H member. I was in my local FFA chapter in high school. Spoiler alert, a lot of the opening and closing of an FFA chapter, if you're a Freemason, you'll be like, wow, that is very familiar to what we do. Yeah.
Really? Oh, I did not know that. Okay.
Those organizations for youth are more than just, as we would say, cows and plows. There's a big community service element that's just a part of it. So everything from working with historical societies, I remember that being a project when I was a kid, to community beautifications. I mean, keep in mind, I grew up in the desert in Arizona. So I remember one year we installed like the drip irrigation style plantery around the Quadrata Extension building to add some, flowers and, desert scenery that was beautiful. Helping out the elderly or those in need, that was something that was instilled into me. But what I would say about servant leadership is I think there's a couple qualities about it. So when I talk to, my team or other teams, I think one major quality is transparency. And this goes beyond like the open door policy. I think transparent leaders are able to tell their team what they need to know, not necessarily on a need to know basis, but in a way that they understand what motivates their team, what inspires their team, and really know how to not necessarily push the passion buttons, but can break it down as to why it matters to them to get them engaged. They're also able to reveal their concerns. They show their emotions freely. They're not this, buttoned up, serious suit person all the time. They're actually a real person. They're somebody that you would look to and be like, yeah, I would follow this person. If they were let go tomorrow, I would go work with them. If they, the whole Jerry Maguire thing, I'll go work with you and, be a part of your startup. I think that's one thing for transparency. The second part of that is that good leaders not only allow the folks that are on their team to make mistakes, and they recognize that as a learning example. Now, again, if it's a mistake that gets repeated over and over, that's a problem. But if it's a screw up, it's how we learn. And the lesson there is that nobody died unless somebody did, and then that's unfortunate. But for the most part, it's how well you recover and what you do in a crisis or a moment of situation that doesn't exasperate or make that mistake even worse. What I always find impressive is when a leader screws up and tells me before I find out that they made a mistake, and then say, and here's how we're going to fix it together. Here's my plan to recover from this. And now I understand that like mistakes are part of being human, but they're also part of a learning process. And it really is what separates a leader from somebody who just tries to lead from on top. The second person the second concept that I have is, I've said this to countless directors and people that were above me, is I remind them that if you saw the movie recently, even Napoleon would carry a sword into battle. So sometimes it's very necessary for a leader to jump off their horse and get into the mix of it with the rest of their team. Not only because you're a member of the team, but because you provide some level of skill or talent. And it really is impressive when you think about it. Like, I work for a CEO now. His big thing is he's the leader's eat last guy. He'll let everybody else, come up. He'll eat last. I think that's a wonderful sentiment. But the other thing is that when we're in a situation, he will jump in and you'll be like, this is why this person is in this spot, because they were a master in these areas of business. Doesn't have to be a master in all areas of it, but is able to kind of flex that muscle. And it's very inspiring to see them kind of get in the mix of it as well. The Craftsman Online podcast is now sponsored by BricksMasons.com, our favorite destination for all of our Masonic shopping needs. Whether it's apparel for yourself or a cool gift idea for another brother, make BricksMasons.com your online marketplace where tradition meets innovation. Hey, did you know if you can't find it, there's a pretty good chance you can online at bricksmasons.com and get it personalized? Bricks Masons offers larger orders and customizations. Whether you have a design or you choose to work with one of their in-house designers, you can bring your Masonic item, your vision, to life at bricksmasons.com. Visit bricksmasons.com and explore their extensive catalog. Elevate your Masonic experience with style and substance. Plus, Craftsman Online podcast listeners use promo code CRAFTSMAN, that's CRAFTSMEN, at checkout to enjoy free shipping with your first order.
Who are you looking up to these days? Who are your mentors? Who are the people that you're looking at or looking to and saying, you know what, I'm taking some notes on what he or she is doing. I'm going to implement that in my operation.
Yeah, so for me, I do have, one of my early and I would say OG mentors was one of my first program directors when I moved to Albany, New York, after having worked in Arizona for 5 or 6 years. He really saw a lot of my potential. We're less in touch now. Now we basically keep in touch with like LinkedIn messages, but we used to go to lunch. We would have, semi-regular phone calls. He still texts, even though he's like in his 70s. I was always impressed with that. So that was somebody that has, Buzz has been a really good friend of mine and somebody that I'd look to as a mentor. Actually, one of the books he gave me, I still hold on to today. I don't lend that one out. That's the 21 Immutable Laws of Marketing. And I have that highlighted and there's notes all over the place, and his note to me is something special. Masonically, yeah, I have brothers either here at my lodge in DC or back in New York or at the Grand Lodge of New York, who I'm close with and will turn to with questions. But honestly, the one thing that this may sound really crazy, but I tend to work best with people who are the furthest from the situation. I feel like they have the best insight to give me. So like right now, when it comes to kind of navigating this new career that I'm trying to carve or craft for myself, I'm working with a colleague that works with me in the building. Actually, she's virtual. She hardly ever comes in. And we just talk about like what we're trying to do with our careers, where we'd like to be, a lot of storyboarding and kind of building this path together. So it's not necessarily a mentor-mentee relationship, because I would say we're pretty equal in our job title and in our experience, but it's more of like a cohort, which I haven't had one of those in a really long time.
Let's shift a little bit here. Sounds like at some point in time, you'd mentioned when you were radio, the writing was on the wall with the radio, and you were contemplating a shift in vocation and so on and so forth. It sounded like you took a good look at maybe yourself or what was happening, and you had to really have a moment to figure out exactly how you're going to shift or pivot. Talk to me a little bit how you led yourself through that scenario. To the point I think maybe you alluded to, a lot of people would maybe have a meltdown, they'd panic, they'd be in a state of panic or a state of depression. Did you experience something similar, and how did you work through it?
So that was just a difficult time, I think, for the country in general. Like, let's go back. This was the final term of George W. Bush. Barack Obama had just been elected. 2008, we were in a massive economic downturn.
Yeah.
I don't think there was a community around the country that wasn't affected. You probably had homes in your neighborhood where they just fell vacant or emptied, or you had squatters that were there because people just couldn't afford these mortgages. And, there was companies that were folding, our auto companies, our big industries in America were failing, and we were all looking to hope was the one thing we had to hold on to. And most people will tell you in leadership, hope is not a strategy. So we were really in desperation mode. So the country was hurting, and the community that I lived in at the time was hurting. And I kind of had probably a stronger pulse or feeling of the pulse, because working in media, which, we rely on commercials and advertisers, when our big clients were starting to cut their budgets, we knew that there was something this wasn't right.
Right.
So for me, I just kind of realized that, this was a dream of mine and it just wasn't going to happen. It was going to be okay. I would just have to find something else. That almost provided a little layer of excitement because I'm like, well, what else is it that I like to do? My personal belief is like, there's the old debate, like, are leaders born or is leadership a skill? And I lay on the side that leadership is a skill. I think it's something that can be taught. If you look at people who enter the military and have close to zero confidence and learn how to not only manage themselves, but manage peers or others, those are leadership skills. Like, yeah, they're probably not going to lead the Department of Defense someday, but they can lead others and they can also impact the lives of others in their family or are around them.
Oh, I completely agree. I mean, and I'll look at myself. I was not a natural born leader by any stretch of the imagination. I was very much a follower. When I was a kid, when I was growing up, I just follow the crowd. It wasn't me out front leading.
We are in a election year this year. So if you have a general interest of politics, or maybe you follow it a little bit more closely, you've heard the expression strong leader. And that's one of, the ratings per se that a candidate will get judged upon. And I think that people have the idea of what a strong leader is that they're out in front, that they're the speaker, they're the mouthpiece, they're the Some of the strongest leaders I've ever seen are the ones that say the least, but behind the scenes are doing the most. So my first example would be to any parent who's listening right now. You're a leader. You're an example. You're telling children what to do. And if you're sitting there going, no, I'm not. They don't think about your own parent and the lessons that you have now in parenting. And you've either chosen to emulate your parent or you've said the famous thing, I'm not going to be like my dad or my mom. The people that I think are the most impactful and important leaders, and you touched on it, are the adults in communities that are around young people. The words and how you say things to a young person, when it's said the right way, are the things that could change a life and, really change. It's that butterfly effect. Whenever I speak to adults is when you're talking with young people, be real with them. But also don't make the mistake of trying to be their friend. Be the mentor that they need in life.
You said you have kids yourself. Are they,
Yeah. Yep. They don't listen to me.
What?
So.
The reason I was asking, I've got grown children myself. So, I mean, I think that's so spot on what you just said. I think most of us get our start as leaders. I'm using air quotes, but I mean, that's where we get our feet wet. We don't realize that's where we're starting with a lot of times, but you stop teaching and you're more coaching now because they've soaked in the lessons. Most of the lessons they're going to soak in.
Yeah, the questions get a little bit bigger.
I used to laugh. I tell people I think I'm more stressed now that they're all grown up than when they were kids.
So, true story. I worked for a general manager of a group of 8 radio stations. He had 0 radio experience. He had very little management experience. Actually, his role before he actually got into radio sales, which then led to becoming, the general manager of 8 radio stations, was he was a security guard at the local mall. And his job was to, chase the shoplifters out and grab them before they got off property and get, the stolen items back. And I was sitting in his office one day and I'm like, so you didn't go to college. You barely finished high school. You were a security. How the heck did you learn the skills you need to do to lead 8 radio stations? And he's like, I'm a father of 6 kids.
I believe it. People would comment on efficiency and so on. I'm like, well, I raised 5 kids. And my youngest was special needs. So, I mean, I've learned everything I had to by being thrown in the deep end of the pool. We only got a few minutes left, Michael. Let me ask you, so what's next? You said right now you're currently master of your Masonic Lodge. What's on the horizon? You got any projects that you're queuing up for execution, or Anything exciting on the horizon?
Brother Jim, that's a great question. I got a couple things. First, on a Blue Lodge level, as the master of my lodge, I think the big thing for me, and I hate to bring in a corporate word here, but is synergy. I'm not even halfway through my Masonic year in the East, but I'm already looking to working with my senior warden on his trestle board for next year, looking at some of the initiatives and goals that he has, and how can we try to incorporate them during the time that I still have left in serving our lodge, and even extending that beyond to our junior warden. I want to make sure that he's in a great spot and thinking about plans that he would have in 2 years as he looks to move to the East. And still, again, working with some of our younger leaders, the deacons and newer members, and encouraging them to want to take leadership positions, to remove the fear of being the one in charge, to where they feel that they can look at the other brothers of the lodge as a resource, those skills, those talents, and how can you incorporate them into goals that you have and where we want to go. Another big part of my trestle board this year was establishing a strategic planning committee made up of some of our past masters and some of the young leaders in the lodge, really looking forward ahead to the next 5 to 7 years. Like, where are we standing, not only financially, but in the community and with each other? How can we continue to deliver on that promise of creating value and being a member, an active member of St. John's Lodge number 11? Well, still being a New York Freemason, I'm excited to get to work with our new Most Worshipful Grand Master, Brother Stephen Rubin, not only a great friend and mentor in Masonry, but also my co-founder and business partner here with Craftsman on Live, but in an official capacity of New York. I'm hoping that the paperwork goes through so that I can serve as the Grand Lodge of New York representative here in D.C., and continue to spread that cement of brotherhood and fellowship between these two great jurisdictions.
Right. You're continuing Craftsman online, it sounds like, then. That's going to be something that's still in a growth mode.
Yeah, well, at Craftsman Online, that's a great question. We continue to grow. We started out as an initiative from 2020 when a lot of brothers around New York State just wanted a digital space to connect and learn and grow from each other. So we started with Zoom meetings at first. We had a great lineup of presentations and speakers that talked on a wide range of issues, from this here, lodge management, lodge leadership, but also into how we could bring Masonic education organically into our meetings and engage our brothers with content that's going to inspire them so that they stay connected and energized in Freemasonry. I think one of the great things that we have going on now is our Craftsman Online blog, where brothers from all around the world can now contribute articles or presentations that they're sharing in their lodges to a wider space. If you'd like to learn more about that, you can visit our website, which is craftsmanonline.com. We also launched our reading room program, which is a place for brothers that, are really into deep thought, our readers, our thinkers who wanted to have a panel of brothers that got together and found Masonic texts or selected books. And we read a couple chapters from that and share insights. And that's something that we do quarterly. We open it up to anyone who has an interest in Freemasonry. And you can learn more about our reading room program and get details on our next event and even the free reading materials, again, at craftsmanonline.com. As far as the podcast, I couldn't be more proud of where we are now into our 4th season. Obviously, this episode, and you, Jim, thank you so much for inviting me on the radio program. Our Craftsman Online listeners will hear this as a podcast episode, but it's been a great pleasure for me to connect with men from all around the world who are tied to this fraternity, members who are doing amazing things in the areas of Masonic research, leadership, esoteric thought, discovery. We have a great phrase that we say, modern men exploring the ancient mysteries of Freemasonry, and we continue to showcase that week after week with new episodes every Monday morning on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and pretty much everywhere you hear podcasting. Last but not least, we launched a new podcast under the Craftsman Online umbrella this March, the Daily Masonic Progress podcast, which is hosted by Right Worshipful Darren Ollett. He is an Australian Freemason. I'm so happy to have him on board. Darren's podcast is a little different than mine. Instead of being more of a conversational or interview style podcast, Darren comes on and shares practical ideas and personal growth and development lessons that brothers can listen to in about 5 to 7 minute snippets in an episode. And it's something that you can take the Masonic lessons and values that are in our ritual, that are discussed in our lodges, and inject that into your life every single day. So really couldn't be happier with where we are set up, looking to the future and beyond at craftsmanonline.com.
Geez, I enjoy listening to the podcast. I probably, as a lot of older guys my age, it took me a little while to get into the podcast realm, but now I listen to probably too many of them because sometimes I don't keep up, but yours is one of them. I'm so thankful that you were able to come on and talk shop with me tonight, Michael.
Well, I'd like to thank Right Worshipful Jim MacDuff for having me on his program, Everyday Leaders. Don't forget the link to check out his program will be in the notes for this episode. If you've enjoyed the Craftsman Online podcast, hey, make sure to follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. We got new episodes coming every Monday morning. This is Worshipful Brother Michael Arce. I've enjoyed our time together. Until we meet again, let peace and harmony prevail.